Whether you are a theology student prepping for a totally grueling seminar, or maybe a history buff trying to trace the tectonic plates of cultural shifts, or honestly just someone out there looking for that next great aha moment without drowning in an ocean of information overload, you have come to the right place.
Mm-hmm.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We are jumping straight into a topic today that is, frankly, universally fascinating. We are taking a massive magnifying glass to the contemporary landscape of Christian fragmentation, denominationalism, and the recurring, almost desperate call to reform.
It really is a massive topic.
It is. And the mission for today is to figure out how a movement that began with a radically unified shared vision of life somehow evolved or maybe devolved into what we now effortlessly recognize as a hyper-fragmented religious marketplace.
Right.
Our roadmap for this entire exploration comes from a brilliant stack of 3 essays by Jamie Thornberry. Those are Schisma and Ontological Disruption, The Corrosive Effects of Sectarianism on the Visible Church, and finally, The Emergence of Denominationalism.
A really incredible trio of essays.
Yeah, and I want to stress right out of the gate to you listening, this is not a dry, dusty history lesson about old councils and forgotten schisms.
No, not at all.
This is a profound, twisting story about human nature, the subtle, creeping mechanics of institutional power, and really the fundamental evolution of how we even define community.
It is a staggering historical and philosophical arc. What makes these essays so compelling is how they force a complete re-examination of our baseline assumptions regarding what it actually means to belong to a group.
Mm-hmm.
When you trace this lineage, you stumble upon a startling realization. The modern, everyday concept of joining an organization where you evaluate your options, select a brand that fits your demographic, and just sign up is a total 180-degree reversal of the ancient spiritual logic that governed the early church.
A total reversal.
Exactly. You're looking at how humanity completely flipped the original blueprint upside down, taking a reality of shared organic existence and morphing it into an exercise in consumer choice.
Yeah. Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand how completely we have drifted, we have to establish that original baseline first. Thornberry lays out this New Testament framework in the first essay, Schisma and Ontological Disruption. I was genuinely blown away by the vocabulary here.
The vocabulary is key.
It really is.
Yeah.
The entire ancient blueprint rests on 3 foundational concepts, which are love, life, and light. The text argues that love unites, life integrates, and light clarifies. In this framework, unity isn't something you legislate through a committee.
Right.
It is an organic reality. But what really caught my attention was the breakdown of the Greek terminology. Take the word for church, ecclesia. I always just read that as, the congregation.
Most people do.
But Thornberry points out it comes from ek, meaning out from, and kello, meaning to call. So it's literally an assembly that is summoned or called out. You are the expert on the historical context here. How radically did Jesus alter that word when he used it? Because ecclesia was just a normal civic word back then, right?
It was entirely civic. In the Greco-Roman world, an ecclesia was essentially a town hall. Okay. It was an assembly of citizens gathered to discuss political matters, levy taxes, or maybe declare war. It was a human institution built by human agency for human administration.
Right.
But when you look at the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16, Jesus appropriates this civic term and radically reframes it. He says, I will build my church. The profound shift there is the architect.
Ah.
The church, in its original conception, is not fundamentally constructed by human leadership structures, ecclesiastical boards, or strategic planning committees. It is formed entirely by the calling power of Christ's word. It is a community summoned into participation in divine reality. It is an ontological shift moving people from one state of being into another.
Which means it isn't a club you decide to start in your living room. It is a reality you are summoned to participate in.
Precisely.
And that leads directly to the next massive concept, which is koinonia. The root there is koinos, meaning common or shared. In most English translations, this gets rendered as fellowship. And I have to admit, fellowship sounds incredibly weak to a modern ear.
It really does.
It sounds like, forced conversation over lukewarm coffee in a church basement.
The modern lexicon has absolutely neutered that word. We use fellowship to describe a casual social mixer, but the New Testament usage of koinonia is vastly more robust and intense. It describes a profound, visceral participation in a shared reality.
So it's much deeper.
Much deeper. Look at the language in Acts 2, where the early believers devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the koinonia, the breaking of bread and prayers. Or Paul in 1 Corinthians 10 asking rhetorically if the cup of blessing is not a koinonia in the blood of Christ. This is not casual socializing. This is an intersection of the divine and the human.
It operates on two axes, right? Vertical and horizontal. You share in Christ vertically, and because of that, you inherently share in one another horizontally.
That is the exact geometry of it, yes.
To make this participatory ontology concrete for you listening, think about it like this. Imagine you join a local running club. You pay a fee, you get the neon yellow team jersey, and you show up at the park on Saturday mornings.
A classic institutional model.
Right. That is an institutional affiliation. You are unified because you agreed to the rules and put on the same shirt. But the early church's concept of koinonia wasn't like putting on a team jersey. It was like discovering a completely new atmosphere.
I love that analogy.
You aren't just wearing the same colors. You are suddenly breathing the exact same air, relying on the exact same oxygen to survive. You are sharing a life force.
That analogy perfectly captures the ontological difference. When you are breathing a shared atmosphere, competition naturally dissolves because your survival is mutually dependent.
Wow.
Your identity is no longer derived from your institutional boundaries, but from this shared life. And understanding that atmospheric unity is the only way to properly understand its opposite, which brings us to the concept of schisma.
Right, schisma, the root of schism or division. Thornberry defines this very strictly based on the text, and it is not just having a disagreement about theology.
Far from it. Within the love, life, and light framework, schisma represents a severe dislocation from the living center. The rupture does not originate in Christ. It happens when human attention is redirected towards substitute identities.
Substitute identities. That is a heavy phrase.
It is. A schism occurs when the allegiance shifts from participation in that shared divine life to secondary human-constructed structures.
A dislocation from the living center.
Yeah.
That implies you stop breathing the shared atmosphere and start obsessing over who has the most authentic team jersey.
Exactly.
But let me play devil's advocate for a second here. I get what Thornberry's saying about this beautiful organic koinonia, but isn't there a risk of looking at the past through rose-colored glasses?
There always is.
We know from the texts themselves that the early church was messy. They were arguing over food distribution, over circumcision, over who was the best teacher. Was this organic unity ever actually a lived reality, or was it just a soaring theological ideal that fell apart the second humans got involved?
That is the essential tension, and it bridges perfectly into the second essay regarding the corrosive effects of sectarianism. The original blueprint was immediately tested by the realities of human nature. The ideal of koinonia was real, but maintaining it required immense continuous effort. The gravitational pull of human sociology is always toward tribalism.
You can practically hear the Apostle Paul pulling his hair out in his letters to Corinth. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, he's dealing with a community that is already fracturing along partisan lines.
Yes, the factions were forming very early.
He writes about how they are running around saying, I follow Paul, or I follow Apollos, or I follow Cephas. They are forming factions anchored to their favorite charismatic leaders. And Paul fires back, is Christ divided? He is condemning this instinct to build identity around human leadership right from the jump.
His reaction proves that the tribal instinct was present, but it also proves that partisan identity was considered anathema to the fundamental nature of the ecclesia. But consider how they handled more systemic conflicts. Look at the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15.
Okay, let's look at that.
You had a massive, potentially community-shattering dispute over whether non-Jewish converts needed to adhere to Jewish law. What is instructive is not that they had a conflict, but how their ecclesial imagination functioned to resolve it.
The goal was always the restoration of the unified body. They didn't say, well, the Hellenists and the Hebrews have irreconcilable cultural differences, so let's just plant two different denominations and agree to disagree.
Exactly. Institutional separation wasn't even on the menu of options. The assumption was that Christ had one body. Fragmentation was treated as a disease to be cured, not a structural reality to be accommodated.
Right.
But as we move forward in history, that underlying assumption undergoes a massive distortion during what historians call the medieval synthesis.
Right. For roughly a millennium, Western Christianity operates under this towering unified structure centered on Rome, while Eastern Christianity develops along parallel Orthodox lines. But how do we get from a spiritual shared atmosphere to a rigid geopolitical empire?
The shift happens when koinonia calcifies into a political apparatus. Following the Constantinian shift in the 4th century, the church became increasingly intertwined with state power. The medieval synthesis preserved the idea that the church was a single, universal institution, one visible body. But the nature of that unity changed profoundly. Religious authority and political order became virtually indistinguishable.
Think about the investiture controversy in the 11th and 12th centuries. You had popes and emperors essentially going to war over who had the right to appoint local church officials.
A perfect example.
Why? Because a bishop wasn't just a spiritual shepherd breathing the shared air. A bishop was a secular lord who controlled massive tracts of land, wealth, and military levies. The spiritual reality was completely swallowed by geopolitical stakes.
And that fusion created a unity maintained by coercion. The medieval church functioned as the spiritual foundation of all social and political life. You didn't choose to join the church any more than you chose your nationality. You were born into it.
You just were part of it by existing.
Exactly. The ontological reality of the church was fused with the soil of Europe. It was a magnificent, sweeping architecture, but one that relied on political power, rigid hierarchical control, and sometimes violent suppression of dissent, rather than the organic love, life, and light framework.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the powder keg of the 16th century, the Reformation. Now, Thornberry makes a crucial point here that often gets lost in popular history. When you look at the towering figures of the era, Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, they did not sit down with a strategic plan to create new, competing denominations.
That was absolutely not their objective. Their initial intent was deeply conservative in a structural sense. They wanted to reform the doctrine and the practice of the existing unified church. They sought to cleanse the medieval synthesis of its abuses and return to the primacy of the gospel. But their theological protests collided with powerful, pre-existing historical forces.
Let's connect this to the broader geopolitical picture, because this is where the timeline really accelerates toward fragmentation. You have a deep theological disagreements about justification and authority, yes, but you also have the rise of distinct national identities and, crucially, European rulers who see a strategic advantage in backing these reform movements to break the political power of Rome.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this leads to the phenomenon of confessionalization. Theological disputes became hopelessly entangled with European political alliances.
Right.
If a local prince in Germany found Luther's theology persuasive, or maybe found the prospect of seizing church lands politically advantageous, suddenly his entire territory became a Lutheran state.
So you end up with a map of Europe looking like a patchwork quilt. Lutheran territories, Reformed territories, Catholic territories, each developing their own rigid institutional structures, backed entirely by the coercive power of the state.
Yes, very rigid borders.
But the vital nuance here, and this blew my mind when thinking about the psychology of the era, is that even with these visible hard borders, each of these groups still operated under the assumption that they were the one authentic continuation of the historic church.
That is a critical distinction to make. A 16th century Calvinist in Geneva or a Catholic in Bavaria did not possess the modern paradigm of denominationalism. They did not view Christianity as a pluralistic field of competing organizations with equally valid claims to truth.
They weren't shopping around.
No, they believed in the one true church. They just believed the other groups were heretical usurpers. They saw themselves as temporarily geographically separated from the rest of the unified body, waiting for the political and theological victories that would restore universal unity under their confession.
They didn't think we are the Reformed brand, they are the Catholic brand. They thought we are the church and they are the enemies of God. And that absolute uncompromising mindset is what leads directly to centuries of unimaginable bloodshed.
It does.
Which transitions us into Thornberry's third essay, The Emergence of Denominationalism, and really the pivotal turning point of this entire story.
The era of the European wars of religion is one of the darkest chapters in Western history. For over a century, the continent was torn apart by conflicts fueled by these confessional rivalries, culminating in the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648.
Here's where it gets really interesting and, frankly, incredibly grim. To understand why the modern church looks the way it does, you have to understand the sheer devastation of the 30 Years' War. We're talking about a conflict that decimated Central Europe.
The scale of destruction was unprecedented.
Armies of mercenaries pillaging the countryside, massive famines, disease. Some estimates suggest that parts of Germany lost up to half of their population. You have millions of people dead, fundamentally over the question of which confession gets to control the geopolitical reality of the one true church.
The psychological trauma of that scale of violence cannot be overstated. By 1648, sheer exhaustion set in. The European powers realized that total confessional victory was impossible.
They just gave up.
Essentially, yes. The result was the Peace of Westphalia. And Thornberry rightly highlights this as the great structural pivot.
The Peace of Westphalia basically throws up its hands and says, we cannot keep slaughtering each other over the Eucharist. It officially accepted permanent confessional plurality. Theological unity as a state objective yielded to political tolerance.
Right.
The treaty established that sovereign states could determine their own internal religious confessions, and minorities would be somewhat tolerated. They agreed to disagree, just to stop the bleeding.
It was a pragmatic political settlement, but it profoundly, irreversibly altered the ecclesial reality. The pursuit of universal visible unity was functionally abandoned. Plurality became the accepted, legalized norm.
It was the new baseline.
But Westphalia was just the political mechanism. The true ontological shift occurred on the heels of that peace, driven by the intellectual earthquake of the Enlightenment.
Enter John Locke.
John Locke's letter concerning toleration, published in 1689, provides the philosophical justification for what Westphalia politically mandated. Locke was trying to solve the problem of religious violence, and his solution was revolutionary.
What did he propose?
He argued that the state's power only extends to civil interests, life, liberty, property, and cannot dictate the salvation of souls.
Which sounds completely normal to us today. We take the separation of church and state totally for granted, but the way Locke defines the church is the real shocker here.
He defines a church as a voluntary society of men, joining themselves together of their own accord in order to the public worshiping of God.
Let that phrase sink in for a minute for everyone listening. A voluntary society of men joining themselves together of their own accord. That is a staggering conceptual leap from the ecclesia we talked about in part 1.
It is a totally different universe.
We went from a community summoned into existence by the calling power of Christ, sharing a participatory reality, to a voluntary club that you choose to join based on your own internal personal convictions.
It is the ultimate reframing of religious life. Enlightenment thought privatized faith. It conceptualized religious communities as secondary associations formed by individual choice, much like a joint stock company or a philosophical guild.
Wow. A joint stock company.
If faith is entirely a private matter of individual conscience, then a church is merely an aggregation of private faiths. And once religion is understood in that framework, multiple different churches can exist in the same town without any logical contradiction.
Because they're just different clubs.
Exactly. You are no longer incorporated into a divinely constituted transcendent communion that precedes you. You are opting into an organization that aligns with your pre-existing views.
And when you take that Enlightenment philosophy, this idea of voluntary societies, and you drop it into a vast landscape with absolutely no state-sponsored church to enforce a monopoly, you get an absolute explosion.
You certainly do.
I'm talking about North America. Thornberry describes this as the rise of the religious marketplace. Sociologists refer to it as a religious economy.
The American frontier was the perfect incubator for this. Without state funding or state coercion, religious groups suddenly had to compete for adherents to survive. They relied on persuasive preaching, massive revivals, and aggressive evangelism. The democratization of American society bled directly into its religious structures.
In this marketplace environment, the dynamics shift entirely. Churches begin to function as organizations offering religious goods and services. The people sitting in the pews or the pioneers choosing which tent revival to attend begin to act as consumers evaluating their options.
They're shopping.
And the denominations themselves effectively become competing brands. They had to differentiate themselves to survive in the market. So what do? They loudly highlight their specific doctrinal distinctives, their unique forms of governance, their worship style.
It is basic market differentiation.
It becomes exactly like walking down the cereal aisle at the grocery store. What flavor spirituality do you want? Do you want the high liturgy traditional brand with the incense, the contemporary worship brand with the smoke machines and the killer coffee bar in the lobby,
Right.
the culturally conservative brand, the progressive social justice-oriented brand? It's all packaged and sitting there on the shelf. And this creates what Thornberry brilliantly terms an ontological misalignment.
Let's drill down into that misalignment because it raises a critical question about the sequence of belonging. Think back to the original New Testament model, the koinonia. The order of operations was clear. You participate in divine life through the Spirit, and that shared life inherently makes you part of the unified community.
So participation first, affiliation second.
Exactly. Your participation precedes your affiliation. The community is a result of the shared life. The marketplace model completely reverses the sequence.
Right. In the modern landscape, you shop for an institution first. You evaluate the preaching style, the theology, the children's ministry. You choose an organization, and then you attempt to experience a sense of community within that strictly bounded institutional framework.
Yes.
Identity begins with institutional affiliation, not participation in a shared transcendent reality.
It is the application of the consumer mindset to the transcendent, and it fundamentally displaces the church's center of gravity. Going back to Thornberry's original love, life, and light framework, in a competitive marketplace, love, which is meant to unite believers across all boundaries, becomes restricted to internal group solidarity.
It shrinks.
It does. Life, which is meant to flow freely through the entire body, becomes compartmentalized inside institutional silos. And light, which should illuminate truth universally, is suddenly filtered through the highly specific proprietary lenses of competing doctrinal identities.
So you end up with completely separate worlds.
You are left with parallel religious ecosystems that rarely interact, rather than a unified witness to the world.
I really want you, listening right now, to reflect on how consumerism shapes your own worldview in this regard. Think about how effortlessly we view community, belonging, and even truth itself as products to be selected and curated.
It is so ingrained in us.
We naturally look for the group that perfectly aligns with our pre-existing preferences, our politics, our comfort zones, rather than submitting to a shared reality that might actually challenge us or force us to grow alongside people we fundamentally disagree with. We treat a living communion like a Netflix subscription. If the content stops catering to our exact tastes, we just cancel and subscribe to a different one.
And this brings us to the operational reality of these parallel ecosystems. Once an organic, living body morphs into a self-preserving institution operating in a marketplace, certain sociological mechanics inevitably take over.
It's unavoidable.
It is. In Thornberry's essays, the synthesis of these sectarian mechanisms is incredibly clarifying. There are 4 specific dynamics of sectarian identity that we need to examine to understand how these fragmented groups survive and entrench themselves.
Let's break those down. The first dynamic is boundary formation. Now, every group needs some form of identity, and theological clarity is obviously important. You have to stand for something.
Of course.
But in a sectarian environment, these necessary boundaries mutate. They stop being tools for safeguarding the essential core of the faith, and instead become rigid markers of exclusivity.
They become weapons of differentiation. The group maintains its cohesion not by celebrating its shared center, but by constantly highlighting how it differs from everyone else. This naturally bleeds into the second dynamic, which is institutional self-preservation.
The survival instinct.
This is the instinct of any organization, whether it is a massive tech conglomerate, a nonprofit charity, or a religious denomination. The organization wants to survive, protect its assets, and grow. But over time, the priorities quietly, almost imperceptibly, shift.
The mission starts serving the institution instead of the institution serving the mission. Maintaining the funding, growing the membership rolls, paying the staff, and expanding the institution's cultural influence start taking precedence over the actual spiritual mandate.
Right.
All the energy goes into keeping the machinery running and the seats full.
And to manage that complex machinery, you require the third dynamic, which is leadership authority structures. Again, practical governance is necessary. You need administrative order.
Someone has to keep the lights on.
Exactly. However, when centralized authority structures, boards, bureaucracies, credentialing committees become insulated from meaningful accountability, they foster rigid hierarchies. They become mechanisms for controlling the narrative, disciplining internal dissent, and above all, protecting the institution's brand reputation.
We see that pattern constantly.
Yeah.
Think about almost every major institutional scandal of the last 50 years. The immediate reflex of the leadership structure is rarely transparency. It is almost always damage control to protect the brand, protect the institution at all costs.
That is the reflex.
Finally, we have the fourth dynamic, social identity reinforcement. This is the psychological glue. The members of these specific denominations internalize the brand identity as the very core of the religious belonging.
It creates a powerful, intoxicating sense of in-group loyalty. But the dark shadow of that loyalty is a pervasive outgroup suspicion. You begin to view other individuals who ostensibly share the exact same divine life, not as brothers and sisters, but as competitors, or even as fundamentally compromised because they don't adhere to your specific boundary markers.
Thornberry points out a highly specific and frankly devastating theological consequence of these four dynamics. It is the elevation of secondary issues. Because you are in a marketplace and you need to differentiate your brand from the church down the street, you take secondary, non-essential theological issues and you elevate them to the status of ultimate dividing truth.
Why do they do that?
Because they make for incredible marketing. They give the consumer a clear, tangible reason why your group is superior. But in doing so, you obscure the actual central confession of the faith under a mountain of proprietary doctrines.
What's fascinating here is there is a tragic irony. Many of these structures, boundaries, and leadership hierarchies were originally constructed with noble intentions to protect the truth, to guide the community.
They didn't start out malicious.
No, they didn't. But as they calcify into sectarianism, they end up achieving the exact opposite. They displace Christ as the primary mediator of belonging. The institutional structure, the specific theological tradition, or loyalty to a particular charismatic leader replaces the shared life of the Spirit as the primary connective tissue of the community.
So let's take a step back and look at the macro picture here. If this fragmentation obscures the very core of the message, making the entire movement look petty, tribal, and contradictory to the outside world, what is the end game? Is the church just doomed to perpetually splinter?
That is the big question.
Are we forever trapped in this marketplace as a collection of competing factions? That brings us to our final section, the teleological impact and the path to renewal. Let's look at the consequences Thornberry identifies, and more importantly, the solutions proposed for the future.
We must first squarely face the present impact, which is the severe weakening of the visible witness. Thornberry anchors this in Jesus' prayer, recorded in John chapter 17, verse 21.
The prayer for unity.
Yes. Jesus prays for his followers, that they may all be one so that the world may believe that you sent me. The text explicitly ties the visible unity of the community to the credibility of its mission in the world. When that visible unity is replaced by sectarian rivalry, theological infighting, and consumer competition, the clarity of the gospel is deeply compromised. It looks like just another human power struggle.
So what does this all mean practically? How do we course correct without falling into the classic trap of just starting yet another new denomination that claims to be the real unified one?
The ultimate irony, right?
Exactly. Thornberry provides a surprisingly actionable, grounded blueprint for renewal based on four core principles. The first is recover the primacy of the gospel. This means actively and intentionally recognizing Christ as the true head of the church, rather than deferring to a human CEO, a bureaucratic board, or a historical founder.
Which requires a massive shift in focus.
Thornberry cites Ephesians chapter 1, emphasizing that the community must derive its order and its life entirely from that vertical connection.
The second principle is perhaps the most challenging in a marketplace environment, distinguishing essentials from secondary issues. This requires immense theological humility. Thornberry highlights a famous historical maxim: in essentials unity, in non-essentials liberty, in all things charity.
Love that quote.
If a community can actually operationalize that principle, it completely defangs the sectarian instinct to divide, split, and fracture over every minor doctrinal nuance or preference in worship style.
In essentials unity, in non-essentials liberty, in all things charity. That is a brilliant rule of thumb for almost any complex relationship or organization, honestly.
It really is.
The third principle is actively encouraging interchristian fellowship. This means stepping outside the institutional silo and deliberately collaborating, praying, and building relationships with believers across different traditions. It is demonstrating a shared allegiance to the core reality, even while acknowledging and respecting the different theological dialects.
And the fourth principle serves as the foundation for the other three, recognizing the primacy of love, drawing heavily on Colossians 3:14. Love, not institutional alignment, not perfect theological agreement, and not cultural similarity, is the ultimate bond.
It is the glue.
It is the actual connective tissue of the shared participation in the Spirit. Now, a crucial distinction must be made here because Thornberry is not advocating for a naive post-denominational utopia.
Right. Nobody is saying we need to burn down the buildings, liquidate the assets, and abolish all the historical institutional names.
No. Organizational diversity in and of itself is not the enemy. Different traditions reflect different histories, cultural expressions, and necessary emphases of worship. The enemy is sectarianism.
Sectarianism is the real issue.
A community can absolutely maintain its distinct theological heritage and its historical identity. The key is that it must simultaneously recognize a deeper, shared participation in the spirit that undeniably connects it to the rest of the body. The objective is to ensure that tribal group identity never supersedes the shared allegiance to the living center. It is about recentering the reality of the church on participation in divine communion, rather than demanding strict institutional conformity.
It is about making sure the absolute lifeblood of the community is that shared atmosphere, not the neon team jersey. And that, incredibly, brings us to the end of a truly massive conceptual journey today. We started by unpacking those ancient radical Greek ideals of ecclesia, a community summoned out of the world, and koinonia, a profound shared participation in divine life.
We really covered a lot of ground.
We did. We traced how human weakness and the earliest factions in places like Corinth foreshadowed the massive struggles to come. We walked through the political compromises and coercive power of the medieval synthesis, the explosive fragmentation of the Reformation, and the sheer bloody exhaustion of the Peace of Westphalia.
We examined how Enlightenment philosophy, specifically Locke's concept of voluntary societies, combined with the vast North American environment to birth the modern religious marketplace. We saw how this fundamentally reversed the ontological logic of belonging, transforming believers into consumers and churches into competing brands.
Right.
And we analyzed the corrosive, self-justifying mechanics of boundary formation, institutional self-preservation, and social identity reinforcement that keep this fragmented sectarian system locked in place.
But we also saw Thornberry's hopeful, actionable path forward. A call to recover the primacy of love, to major on the absolute essentials, and to realize that true unity isn't about achieving a corporate monopoly, but about living in an authentic, participatory reality. And as you reflect on all of this, I want you to realize that this dynamic isn't just confined to the pages of religious history.
It certainly isn't.
The human instinct to prioritize group identity and institutional loyalty over shared foundational truth is everywhere you look. You see it in toxic corporate cultures where departments war with each other. You see it fiercely in our modern political affiliations where party loyalty trumps policy. And you see in social movements that constantly fracture over ideological purity tests. The temptation to build a boundary, hide-minded, and declare everyone outside as the enemy is a universal human flaw.
It is the perpetual, exhausting tension between the safety and security of the defined institution and the wild, uncontrollable, transcendent nature of genuine shared life.
Which leaves us with one final provocative thought to chew on. Thornberry emphasizes over and over that the future finality of this community depends on authentic koinonia, a unity that inherently transcends physical organizational structures. Well, look at the world we live in right now.
The digital world.
Yes. We are in a modern era defined by digital, borderless connectivity. We have technologies that entirely bypass physical geography and institutional gatekeepers.
Yes.
So here is the question. How might this new digital landscape accidentally serve as the perfect catalyst for this ancient participatory unity?
That's an interesting proposition.
Could the internet allow people to connect on the essentials, bypassing the local sectarian tribalism entirely? Or will the algorithms, the echo chambers, and the outrage machines of the internet just create a new, invisible marketplace of even more isolated, hyper-specific digital factions? Will our technology heal the schisma, or will it weaponize it on a scale we haven't even seen yet?
That is something to think about.
Let that thought linger as you go about your week. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the roots of community, division, and the hope for a truly shared life. We will catch you next time.